was pointed in its analysis and leaves us, of course, willing to read the second part of the book to get to know more about the solutions. But I think you've been very clear in why you say that aid is part of the problem, is basically a problem on itself, and what should be done to solve that problem and to wean off Africa from aid and get it started in getting out of poverty on its own devices and on its own growth. We have a second lecture for you by Kumi Naidoo, who will approach the same question from his own angle. Kumi, is aid the problem for Africa, and is it the reason why Africa remains poor? You have the floor for another 25 minutes.
Thank you, Belgium. Good afternoon. Dames en heren, as we say in South Africa. Friends, colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen, I just wanted to start with telling Dambisa you shouldn't feel apologetic about quoting Bush there. Because that particular quotation that you used, there's no way that would have come out of his mouth. It must have been written by a speechwriter. I want to start by saying that it is rare for an African to write about Africa. It is particularly rare for an African woman to write about Africa. It's one of the sad realities that most of what is talked about Africa is written outside of our continent. So I'd like to start, even though I will be critical of the conclusions of the book, I want to start by paying tribute to Dambisa for writing this provocative and controversy-promoting book. So I'd like to thank you first. The Africa that we have today is one where 6,000 people die every single day from HIV/AIDS alone, where 7,000 people die from malaria every day alone, and another 1,500 people die from tuberculosis. Put together, that is the equivalent of 5 9/11s every single day. That is why we have to understand the situation that ordinary men, women, and children in Africa find themselves in, is what we might describe as a daily silent tsunami or a passive genocide. It is important that we recall when the commitment of aid was actually made. Dambisa in the book talks very well about the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was 1% over a 4-year period with no conditionalities, no restrictions, and so on. When Nelson Mandela and I launched the Make Poverty History and the Global Call to Action Against Poverty, which some of you might remember by the white band symbol on the street, on the steps of Trafalgar Square in 2005, we said that the commitment of 0.7% was not made 5 years ago or 10 years ago in Monterey. That commitment, ladies and gentlemen, was made in 1970. And we said 35 years, 2005, is a long time to wait for less than 1%. So it is a myth to actually throw around figures which suggest, in fact, that the rich nations of the world who benefited from colonialism have actually paid their debts to Africa. That in fact it's only 5 countries in the world, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Luxembourg, and Holland, that actually meet the 0.7% target. The United States, for example, up to today, even though 65% of the American people believe that the US gives between 10 and 16% of its gross domestic wealth to international development, the reality is that 0.2%. But not only has the volume been a problem, most of the aid that has flown to the continent has actually not been about helping the continent. A lot of the aid has been about governments seeking benefit for themselves back in the donor country. And therefore, one of the key problems of the book is that aid is homogenized, and we don't break up the different kinds of aid in a more detailed way. For example, infrastructure aid, person-to-person aid, social sector aid, and so on. And when you break it up that way, then you begin to see certain types of aid that basically is not only problematic, but is harmful, and other kinds of aid, particularly those that are throwing a lifeline to people who are perishing from the HIV/AIDS epidemic by getting more teachers into schools, by getting more nurses into hospitals. And if we look at the last 5 years in particular, there is evidence to suggest that about 3 million more nurses have been employed in a range of countries that have been beneficiaries of debt reduction. Is the scale of progress sufficient? Absolutely not. But there is no question about saying that all aid is actually flawed. In reality, though, it's important that we recognize that aid is really a very small part of the equation to liberate the African continent from the kind of economic and social devastation that we have. Many of the observations that Dambisa makes is one that I agree with. We need to create decent jobs. We need to actually break down trade barriers between African nations. We need to get greater political and economic integration. I've been saying since the euro emerged in Europe, I've been saying if Europe can have a euro, I don't see why Africa can't have an afro. And I'm not meaning the hairstyle. So there are many things that actually need to be done by African governments. And as somebody who has put my life on the line, including recently when I went into Zimbabwe at Christmas for 10 days, to find out how those of us from the outside within Africa can actually support the devastation that the Mugabe government has actually caused. What I would say is that, and just as a matter of coincidence, Zimbabwe, for example, has been starved of international aid over the last 5 years. Starving of aid has not made it better for the Zimbabwean people. It has actually not seen the Zimbabwean government actually change its way of operating. And I can tell you horrific things that I saw in a country that was the breadbasket of Southern Africa. Bodies rotting in mortuaries because people are too poor to go and pay the bribes to get the family members out, and because the refrigeration doesn't work, and so on and so forth. So when we look at the relationship between rich countries and poor countries today, we must move away from a logic that actually thinks that, in fact, historically, it is the rich countries of the world that have actually helped Africa. Let me tell you that, in fact, today, Africa is aiding many of the developed countries in a very substantial way. The city of Manchester